Okay, hello everybody. Now, because of time constraints, I don't have time to mess about and record a proper video this weekend. So instead, what I've got is my streaming setup left over from this morning, where I did a video moaning about how much I hate Star Wars, which I don't. I love Star Wars, but it's what I do. So I've bled straight from that into this, so I haven't had time to change or do anything else or set anything else up, so I do apologize. I just don't have time to set up cameras and all the other stuff, so I've just used my standard streaming setup. But at least now you get to meet Daisy. This is Daisy. Say hello, Daisy.
Hello, Daisy.
Oh, come on, that's not funny.
You're not funny.
We both know I am. So this is my setup, and we're going to have a look very briefly at clauses. Now, it's come to my attention that this might be in the exam. To quote Star Wars, many Bothans died to bring us this information. In this case, nobody died, but the information was brought to us, and it may or may not be in the exam. I can't say for sure if it is. Don't know, but I've been warned that it might be, and that's what I've heard from the rumour mill. And you know what the rumour mill's like. Shouldn't trust it, but who knows. I'm going to be using my screwdriver as a pointing device. Now, as you can see on the screen, I've given you a picture. This is page 82 from your book. Now, the reason I've never included this in the exam myself, and for one good reason, it's a quick review. We're not breaking any new ground. It's something we've covered ad infinitum before, and I've never really thought it worth going over because it doesn't really lead into anything else, but it might be in the exam this time. So let's go over it very briefly in this lesson, and then we'll look at some other things, and I'll give you some time at the end to get back on to your own review. So quick review, page 82, main clauses. Now, you can't really talk about main clauses without subordinate clauses, but let's read what it says in the book, and then we'll go through some websites, and we'll see if we can clarify this and explain a little better what it's really all about. So quick review, main clause. A main clause is the most important part of a sentence. Usually contains a finite verb, a verb with a tense and a subject. Every sentence should have one main clause. A main clause can be a simple sentence on its own. That's key, so remember that for later. Now she was ready. So we've got the subject, she, and we've got the finite verb, was. Okay, simple as that. Sometimes a sentence has two or more clauses. These main clauses may be jointed by connectors, like we know what connectors are: and, or, but, for, nor, so, and yet. We haven't really touched on fanboys yet, but we will get there. Actually, I don't know, because I think we did that in grade 10. The fanboys, for, and, nor, but, or, yet. So, yeah, fanboys. These connectors are called coordinating conjunctions, and note that a comma comes before such connectors. Now, I know we didn't cover this together, but the reason we use a comma fixes a break in grammar. So where we've got two words smashed together, we use an apostrophe, and a comma works exactly the same way. Think of it as a patch to repair damage in a sentence or in a word. For instance, the most obvious one that you can think of is o'clock. So it's 11 o'clock, O apostrophe clock. And basically the apostrophe fixes the damage where we pulled out the rest of those words, of the clock. It's 11 of the clock. So of and the are ripped out, and we end up with o'clock. And we use an apostrophe to let us know something's missing, and this repairs the damage. Comma does the same thing. Because we've broken the sentence, we now need to put a comma back in it to let us know that it's broken. Take a pause, take a breath as we speak, and accept that, there's some damage here, and we've repaired it. Okay? So, note that a comma comes before such connectors because they're broken. She slept a little, comma, but her sleep was light and fitful. Now, to get it absolutely correct is a little bit more complicated than you think. You've got to use the comma before. You've got to identify that you've got a main clause, another main clause with the connector in between. That's the time when we use a comma before the connector. Sometimes I use it wrong still. I'm not that great with grammar, and I grew up with this. So I will admit that it's slightly complicated, and getting it right is harder than it looks. But when you do get it right, It's fine. When you don't get it right, you look like an idiot. Even when I do it, you look like an idiot. I look like an idiot a lot, so I mean, let's be fair. A semicolon can also be used to join two main clauses. She looked back. No one was watching her. So you've got your main clause and another main clause that join together, smash together, and we use a semicolon to separate them out. A sentence usually contains other, less important information that is not part of the main clause. This information can be contained in a subordinate clause, like an adverbial clause, an adjectival clause, or a noun clause. So now we've got two clauses. She left them knowing it would not be for long, comma, in the middle. Main clause, she left them. Adverbial clause, knowing it would not be for long. Now let's just go back to what we said at the beginning about a main clause being a complete sentence. She left them can be a main sentence. Knowing it would not be for long cannot. We can either use something at the beginning of that, or we can use something at the end of that. Knowing it would not be for long, comma, the cat left her kittens. Now that works perfectly fine. But this sentence on its own, this clause on its own, knowing it would not be for long, doesn't work. It's missing a subject. It doesn't fit. We can't use it. She left them has everything that we need. For a sentence to be a full sentence, we've got the capital letter, we've got the subject, we've got a verb, and we've got a full stop, question mark or exclamation mark. And that has that. She left them. Stop. Works perfectly fine. She is the subject. The verb would be left. Everything works perfectly fine. It works. Narrative should tell the story using a mix of main clauses and subordinate clauses that supply detail about the setting, action, or characters. And of course that's true. Any good story will mix different forms of sentence structure together so that we don't get bored. A great example of that would be The Lion, the Witch and the Wardrobe. Some of you may have covered it in summer school. And it's grammatically perfectly right. It's grammatically absolutely correct. But it uses she said, he said exclusively. So when somebody speaks, in reported speech, it says he said, or Peter said, she said, and that's the only thing it uses. Nobody ever, she said with a smile on her face. He laughed and then said, she whispered. No one ever does any of those things. It's all he said, she said. And it is, after a few pages, tiring to read. So any good story is going to mix things up so that you have different versions of the same sentence. So you have different ways of saying the same thing. Okay, so let's have a look at a couple of websites. Now, if you look on the side, they're up there. They're going to pop up. So let's have a look at these different different websites, and we'll see if any of those do a better job of explaining this. Can't do a worse job, can they? So let's have a look at ThoughtCo. ThoughtCo. Not my favourite website, but not the worst either. So let's have a look. So the links for this are underneath in Google Class. So this is by Richard Nornquist, 2019. Not much has changed since then. Language does change. It's a very dynamic process. Language changes all the time. And that's fine. Language is meant to change. It's all meant to be mixed up and modified ad infinitum, but nothing really changes that seriously within a couple of years, unless there's a global pandemic or something. So, for a sentence to be complete rather than a fragment, now, before we move on, a fragment is where a sentence is incomplete, where we have something missing from our sentence. Normally the subject or the verb is missing. You'll get a report on this. If you do this in Microsoft Word, for instance, you'll get a warning comes up with I think it's a blue underline that will say fragment, which means it's not a complete sentence and it's not grammatically correct. That's what a fragment is. For a sentence to be complete rather than a fragment, it must include a main clause or be a main clause. In English grammar, a main clause, also known as an independent clause, subordinate clause, I'm not sure that's correct, actually. Oh, superordinate, sorry. I was going to say a subordinate clause is not a main clause, so I read that wrong, it's my fault. Known as an independent clause, a superordinate clause or base clause is a group of words made up of a subject and a predicate that together express a complete concept. Okay, they are a complete concept. They do everything that we need to do. The sentence is complete by the time we get to that full stop. It tells us something. So once we've read that sentence, we become a little wiser, we know a little more, and we've completed the thought. Our next sentence can move on and do the same thing, can add more information, and we can learn more from it. But because it's a main clause, it tells us everything we need to know. We can add to it, but we don't need to. With a subordinate clause, we have to, or it doesn't work. Superordinate, I don't think I've ever heard of anybody calling it a superordinate clause. We certainly won't be calling it that in an exam. It'll be you know the difference between independent and dependent. Dependent means it needs something. Independent means it doesn't need anything. So an independent clause means it doesn't require anything else to function. A dependent clause means, of course, it needs something else to make it work. I can imagine it being called a base clause as well. I've not heard it used, that term. Again, you've got to remember a lot of these could be American or even Australian or satisfy some other international grammatical system, but I've never heard it called that. I certainly haven't used it myself, but it makes perfect sense. It's a base clause from which we build upon. It's a group of words made up of a subject. To write sentences effectively, a writer must decide what information to include in the main clause and which to relegate to dependent clauses. The basic rule of thumb is to make sure that the most important information goes into the main clause. Yeah, I think that's pretty obvious. While information that ties things together by providing description and nuance gets placed in the dependent clause. Yes, I would totally agree with that. The primary information, Jack is a teacher. That's what we need to know. Jack is a teacher and he's bald. Okay? You would add nuance, you'd add some kind of extra information. But the main clause tells us what we need to know, and then we add to it with a dependent clause. Examples and observations. In sentence structure, the simple subject is the who, what, and where that comprises the main focus of the sentence. You all know what a sentence subject is. It's what we're talking about. So when we've got a sentence subject, that's the thing that we are discussing. Whether it's a person, a thing, a place, a time, it's what we're talking about. It's the thing that does the action. Okay? The predicate is the part of the sentence, the verb, that shows the action. For example, in the sentence, the angry bear howled ominously. The word bear is the simple subject because it's doing the action, and the predicate is howled. So the main clause of the sentence would be the bear howled. That makes perfect sense. We can take the bear howled. It's a complete sentence all by itself. We don't need to add anything to it. We can and we should, because it's not much of a interesting sentence by itself, so we could certainly expand on it, but we don't need to. To be grammatically correct, the bear howled is perfectly fine. In the concise Oxford Dictionary of Linguistics, oh God, you know this is going to suck when someone says the Oxford Dictionary of Linguistics, P.H. Matthews defined a main clause as a clause which bears no relation other than coordination to any other or larger clause. Right? Well, that makes sense. I mean, can you imagine some people literally make a career out of talking like this? Unlike a dependent or subordinate clause, a main clause can stand alone as a sentence, while two or more main clauses can be joined with a coordinating conjunction, such as and, to create a compound sentence. In the following examples, notice the main clause does not necessarily include modifying words. While Fern was in school, Wilbur was shut up inside his yard, from Charlotte's Web. Those of you that have read that, Wilbur is a pig, and Fern was his owner, and there's also a spider that writes stupid things in webs. It's a terrible story. Actually, it's not a bad story. You have to look at it in context, and the context of it is actually quite interesting. Those of you that have studied it in summer school with a good teacher, it's actually interesting because it was written by E.B. White after a war, and it was really about death. It was a children's story aimed at young children about Wilbur the pig being slaughtered for his meat and eaten, and the spider does her best to try and humanize the pig to get it a reprieve so that it doesn't get killed. But really it's about teaching children the meaning of death, because a lot of their parents, their fathers, weren't coming home. And he'd been through that himself, and he was starting to see a lot of children not understanding why daddy wasn't coming home. And he wrote this story to try and explain what death was and how it works and how it impacts us, to try and teach children who were themselves the victims of a war in a roundabout sort of way, to teach them about the implications of death and suffering. And as dark as that is, this is the world we could live in, and that's why it's one of the nice things about where we live. I mean, you know, your generational defining event is probably going to be COVID. Well, unless much more severe things come from it in terms of civil wars. And we haven't had to go through a world war where, you know, fathers are never coming home again, where children as young as 17 are taking up arms against their enemies. So we've got off pretty lightly in this generation. So the main clause here, Wilbur was shut up. Since Fern was in school is modified by the word while. While is a subordinate conjunction. While Fern was in school is a subordinate clause rather than a main clause. The takeaway here is that Wilbur was shut up is a sentence. By itself, it's the main clause, and that's how we spot a main clause. It is a sentence all by itself. It doesn't need anything else. It's independent. Dinner always took a long time because loved food and he was very slow. I don't know what that's from. Antonopoulos? I don't know what an antilopoulos is. I think it's a mispronounced antelope or hippopotamus. I really don't know. From The Heart is a Lonely Hunter. I know nothing about this book. Didn't even know it existed. Never heard of this writer. Consequently, probably don't really care. So the main clause is dinner took a long time. Because Antilopoulos loved food and he was very slow. Hippopotamuses aren't slow, in fact. Interesting fact, more people are killed in Africa by hippopotamuses than any other animal, including lions, hyenas, all sorts of other creatures, because hippopotamus looks slow and cute, and it's not. It's a brutal, terrible thing that runs at you and you can't get away from it, and it just runs you down. Since it's modified by the word because, another subordinate conjunction, because Antilopoulos loved food and he was very slow, is a subordinate clause. I learned to type when I was 12 years old. When I finished the class, my father bought me a Royal Portable Typewriter from The Writing Life by Ellen Gilchrist. Again, sorry, never heard of that one. I have nothing to add. I learned to type when I was 12 years old. I probably did too, actually. I was one of the lucky kids in my generation. My father was a computer engineer when I was quite young. So he used to bring home Compaq. I don't know if Compaq's still around. They were pioneers in terms of laptop technology, computers, and he used to bring home computers. And I was lucky enough to always have the latest computer technology, which was laughable by today's standards. I mean, it was really, really basic. I remember a laptop coming home, which was at least this big, at least this tall, and the screen opened up and the keyboard came out on a wire and it all unfolded into a desktop. And I remember that being cutting edge technology. So the main clause there is I learned to type and my father bought a typewriter. So we've got two. Since when I was 12 years old and when I finished the class are modified by when. Okay, so that makes sense. Yet another subordinate conjunction, they are both subordinate clauses. My father bought a typewriter, obviously is a main clause, we can finish that with a full stop, is the main thought in the second sentence, so it's the main clause. I think this makes perfect sense, and I doubt anyone's really struggling with this at this point. I learned to type when I was 12 years old. When I finished the class, my father bought me a Royal portable typewriter. I wonder what that is. Never seen one. Okay. Got to move my thing. Yes, he can do that until the crops fail one day and he has to borrow money from the bank, from The Grapes of Wrath. Definitely haven't read this one by John Steinbeck because it's American. American literature really sucks because they can't really seem to understand that it's rubbish and no one else cares about it. It only works in America. America's a strange place. Main clause, he can do that and he has to borrow money. In both cases, the subject is he. Do is the verb there. Can is a auxiliary verb. He has to borrow money. Again, actually it's a verb phrase, borrow money. Has to is auxiliary. Since those two clauses are joined by the conjunction and they are both main clauses. Okay, so I hope that makes it a little simpler than what we got in the book. But let's have a look at one more. Now, this is a slightly better website. I use this website a lot. This is chompchomp.com. Now, I use this one quite a lot when I make up worksheets because it's direct, it's simple, it's to the point, and I've given you a link to it because it is all of those things. And it's printer fabulous, as you can see on the screen. I like this website a lot because it's very easy. Most people find it useful, and there's no nonsense. It's direct. So the main clause. Recognize the main clause when you find one. Now, I didn't write the exam. I don't know what's going to be in it, but I imagine if they're going to be talking about main clauses, chances are it's going to be underline the main clause. So this is how it works. Recognize the main clause when you find one. Now, a main clause, sometimes called an independent clause. Remember, independent doesn't need anybody. I'm independent. I don't need anyone's help. That's not true. Nobody's independent. A main clause, sometimes called an independent clause, must contain a subject and a verb because it's a sentence, and it can exist on its own as a sentence. Together, this pair expresses a complete thought. As a complete thought, it is a complete sentence. Read these examples. Diana kicked the soda machine. Stop. Okay? Now, as well as being a complete sentence, we've got the subject, Diana, we've got the verb, kicked, and what she kicked is the subject, the verb, and the object. A giant spider has spun its web behind the shampoo bottle in Neil's bathroom. Now, this is a little bit more of a complicated sentence, but it's still same thing. The spider is the subject, and what has it done? It's spun a web. Okay, so we've got a verb. Seema and Michelle are skipping their chemistry class to sit by the lake. Seema and Michelle are the subjects. Are skipping is the verb. I hope this website goes on beyond this because I think that's actually become needlessly complicated. Because we could have stopped both of these sentences earlier and still formed a main clause. Now let's see what this has got to say about that. You must have at least one main clause in every sentence. And again, a sentence is a clause, is a main clause. So every sentence can either have a main clause or can be a main clause. Remember, that's the rule. You must have at least one main clause in every sentence. A main clause is the essential component. So we are moving on. You all know every sentence has to have a subject and a verb. Well, now we're moving on to say that it has to be a clause. Now, what a main clause is a group of words with a subject and a verb. So all we're doing is the same thing that you already know. We're just adding explanation to it. Now, that might seem stupid. Okay, so instead of now saying every sentence has to have a subject and a verb, we're now saying it has to have a clause, a main clause, which is basically a subject and a verb. So why would we say that in two different ways? What's the point? We're stupid, right? Well, no, because now we're trying to explain that the main verb and the the main clause and the subordinate clause can be separated out so that we can let them do different things. So what we're actually doing is we're not being stupid by giving the same thing two meanings. What we're doing is saying this has a second meaning if we want to analyze the way the sentence is structured. So because we're now going into a more advanced way of looking at sentence structure, we now need more explanation. Okay, so we're not just calling the same thing a different thing. We're saying that as well as being that, it's also this, and we have to have that because it breaks into this as well. So it is a little bit more complicated. It isn't really when we break it down, but it looks on the surface a little more tricky because we're getting into something that's a little bit more complicated, a little bit more clever. You must have at least one main clause in every sentence. A main clause is the essential component. Without a main clause, a group of words is a fragment, a major error in writing. I wouldn't say it was a major error in writing. It's definitely a major grammatical error, and it definitely means your sentence isn't complete. And every single person who reads it will know that, because it won't sound right, it won't feel right, and it will make people judge your work accordingly, especially if you're writing something like an application. People will judge you for it in a harsh way. People are harsh when it comes to judging writing, so be very careful. I've noticed this myself in the almost 10 years I've been teaching. I will speak to you for at least a month. I meet my new classes and I chat with you for a month, and I get you reading out in class and I get you doing your assignments. And we do it for a month. And I start to think, oh yeah, this class is pretty good. They're pretty decent. They know what they're doing. Great. And then, after the first month, I'll usually give you a monthly test and I'll give you a writing assignment. And then I see how bad people are. then I see how bad it is. And I don't know who it is at this point. I'm still not used to names. So what happens is I get all this writing and it's terrible. The tenses are screwed up. There's sentence fragments. There's all sorts of mistakes. And I start thinking, my God, this person's terrible. But it'll be someone I can speak to and think has a great grasp of English. So believe me, when you read something, you're much more critical of it. You don't make allowances. When you speak, because we're so used to people talking in slang, speaking in modern English, speaking in broken English, speaking in colloquialisms, we are very tolerant. People are far less tolerant when they read your writing. Now, that's a problem if you're applying for something or if you're writing a CV and you start making mistakes because your stuff is going in the dustbin. Okay? So be careful of that. Okay. A sentence may contain any number of other grammatical units, such as participle phrases, prepositional phrases, subordinate clauses, appositives, etc. It must, however, contain at least one main clause. It can contain more, but it must contain one. So it must have a sentence, a completed sentence in there somewhere. At some point, your sentence, to be a sentence, must have a complete clause, which means a complete sentence. Consider the examples below. Dissecting a cow heart in her anatomy and physiology class. Shenika realized, there we go, there's the problem. Realized with a Z, that's American. Realized that a cheeseburger, her favorite lunch, was no longer appetizing. Dissecting a cow heart is a participle phrase. In her anatomy and physiology class is our prepositional phrase. Shanika realized is the essential main clause. I'm not sure that's actually correct. That a cheeseburger was no longer appetizing is the subordinate clause. Her favorite lunch is the appositive. I don't think that works. Shanika realized, because it can't be a sentence. All you've got is a subject and a verb, but you've got no... she realized what? I don't think that's a complete thought. Shanika realized. You could have Shanika awoke, and then she wakes up. That's fine. That would be a full sentence. But she realized? I can't imagine writing something where Shanika realized would be used as a complete thought. So I'm sure it's grammatically correct, but it doesn't sound right. And I actually expect this level of English from the book, where we do see a lot of mistakes. I don't expect them from this website. So, but hopefully, me pointing that out, there's probably a few of you that are raising your eyebrows and thinking, "What the hell?" Do not confuse a main clause with a subordinate clause. Now, this is important because in the exam, this is what they're probably going to try and get you to do. When you place a subordinate conjunction, a word like when, because, or even though, in front of a subject and a verb, you will no longer have a complete thought. The group of words becomes a subordinate clause. Notice how one new word creates a mystery. When Diane kicked the soda machine, when Diane kicked it, what happened? Did the soda machine cough up her drink? Did the soda machine fall on top of poor Diane, crushing her underneath? Interesting aside, more people are killed by soda vending machines around the world than by sharks every year. And the number is about 2 to 3. 2 to 3 people every year killed by vending machines, and less by sharks. And then in Australia, they're culling sharks because they kill too many people. But more people are killed by vending machines, presumably in America, where people, I'm not joking, put their hand inside to try and get the money back, and the machine falls on them and kills them. Did quarters shoot out of the coin return like a Las Vegas slot machine payout? Because you no longer have a main clause, you no longer have a complete thought. Okay. Like Shanika realized. Because a giant spider had spun its web behind the shampoo bottle in Neil's bathroom. So again, incomplete thought. Because the giant spider lives there now, what has happened? Did Neil buy a can of insecticide? It depends on how big the spider was. I would just burn the house. Just be done with it. Does Neil now refuse to bathe? Is the spider starving because there's not enough insects for it to eat? The word because, a subordinate conjunction, leaves the idea unfinished, making a fragment. Okay. Even though Seema and Michelle are skipping their chemistry class to sit by the lake. Okay, again, incomplete thought. I'm not really sure what they're trying to get at here, because we all know this already. This is all they're trying. I don't know. Maybe I had to rethink the use of this website. Even though Seema and Michelle are skipping their chemistry class, what else are they doing? Are they also studying their notes? Are they contemplating how the water in the lake is composed of hydrogen and oxygen atoms? I always am. Are they gossiping about their handsome professor? I hope you're not. The addition of even though makes a subordinate clause an incomplete thought. So I hope that gives us a little bit of insight. Not sure if it does or doesn't, to be honest. I had some other websites open. I don't think they help, to be absolutely honest. I think those two probably nail it home. What I want you to remember is how to spot a main clause, how to spot an independent clause. So first of all, know what you're talking about. A main clause is an independent clause. A subordinate clause is an dependent clause. It depends on there being something else. An independent clause doesn't require there being anything else, therefore it's a main or base clause. That's what you need to remember. And a main clause doesn't need anything else because it's a complete sentence all by itself. That's what we're taking away from this lesson, and that's how you're going to spot them in a sentence. Now what I've done is I've given you a bunch of questions on Google Class for review, and links to these websites so you can go through and polish up on them, and the rest of the time in this lesson is just to keep going through your notes. So I hope this helped. I hope this helped put things straight, or at least firmly crooked, and I will see you tomorrow.